That heart-wrenching cry. It still haunts me to this day, a sound lost in the vast harshness of this Wild West. At that time, I was just a 5-year-old kid, clutching a worn-out rag doll, wandering in the tall grass behind my family's tiny cabin. The early morning sun slanted through the sparse trees, casting long shadows across the meadow where I often played alone. My bare feet stepped carefully on the rough ground, trying to avoid the sharp stones on the path leading to the stream. But then, that sobbing sound came back, weak like the cry of a wounded animal. A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity urged me forward. I had no idea at that time that small action of a child could change the fate of an entire land, bringing my family something more precious than any treasure in the world. I pushed my way through the low branches and entered a small clearing. The sight before me took my breath away. A little girl, maybe a year older than me, was huddled under an old tree. Her long black hair was messy, covering most of her face. Her clothes were unlike anything I had ever seen. A soft leather skirt decorated with intricate beading, tiny feathers woven into her hair. But what shocked me most were the tears streaming down her face. Her black eyes were wide with fear, her whole body trembling as she looked up at me. Her eyes like someone who had lost everything. I approached slowly, as my father had taught me to do when approaching frightened animals. I knew, without being told, that this girl was from a tribe that lived somewhere beyond the hill. My parents spoke of them in soft, respectful tone, but they kept a cautious distance because of the differences they did not yet understand. She tried to back away, pressing herself against the tree, but there seemed to be no escape. I saw scratches on her arms and legs, as if she had been running through thorn bushes for a long time. Her bare feet were dirty, with small cuts that showed she had walked a long way without shoes. Without hesitation, I sat down on the grass a few feet away from the frightened girl. I looked down at the rag doll in my hand, the only toy I had ever owned. My mother had sewn it from scraps of fabric during the long winter months, stuffed it with hay and sewed on button eyes with careful needlework. I named it Rosie, and I carried it everywhere. The native girl's cries had softened to small hiccups, but her eyes never left my face. There was something in those dark eyes that I recognized, a loneliness that matched mine. Living far from town, I rarely saw other children, and when I did, they often seemed frightened of my family's simple lifestyle. I held up the doll, smiling softly for her to see. I pointed at myself and said clearly, "Clarabel." Then I pointed at the doll and said, "Rosie." She watched my every move, her breathing slowing. An understanding seemed to spread between us without words. I moved closer, offering the doll in both hands. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she shook her head vigorously, as if the gift was too precious to accept. But I placed the doll in her hands, closing my tiny fingers around Rosie's soft body. For the first time, the native girl's face was no longer frightened. Wonder flashed in her dark eyes as she looked down at the gift, then back up at me. She whispered something in her own language, the words music to my ears, though I didn't understand the meaning. I could feel the gratitude wrapped in the soft syllables. She hugged the doll tightly to her chest. Just as I had done a few minutes ago, we sat side by side in the small clearing as the morning sun rose higher. Two children from two different worlds, sharing a moment that needed no translation. I had never felt so sure of anything in my young life. Giving Rosie away felt as natural as breathing, as right as a shower of rain after a long drought. But as the footsteps echoed through the woods, I had no idea that my simple act of kindness had been witnessed by invisible eyes, and that news of what I had done had spread to a village where such gestures were remembered for generations. The footsteps belonged to Ezra Whitmore, my father, who had been searching for me since discovering my empty bed that morning. His calloused hand brushed the branches, and his eyes took in the scene before him. I sat peacefully beside the native girl, who was clutching something to her chest in utter gratitude. My father's first instinct was to call out, to rush forward and pull me away from what others might consider danger. But something in the stillness of that moment made him pause. He had learned to assess situations carefully during his years on the frontier. And what he saw here was not a threat, but a connection. The native girl looked at him with the same fear she had looked at me, but she didn't run away. I turned to Dad with a bright smile, as if introducing him to a new friend was the most natural thing in the world. Dad, I whisper. She's crying. She needs Rosie more than I do. My father's throat tightened as he realized what I had done. The rag doll that my mother had spent weeks making, the toy that had been my constant companion, was now in the arms of a child who looked like she had been lost for days. He approached slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. The native girl regarded him with intelligent eyes that seemed older than her years. As he knelt beside us, she did something unexpected. She reached into a small pouch tied to her skirt and pulled out something that made my father gasp. It was a carved wooden bird, no bigger than his thumb, decorated with tiny painted details that must have taken hours to complete. She handed it to me with the same generosity I had shown a few minutes earlier. I accepted the gift with reverence, turning the small carving over and over in my hands. The craftsmanship was of a level my father had never seen before, surprisingly delicate and precise, showing generations of craftsmanship passed down through careful instruction. "What is your name?" I asked softly, but the little girl just tilted her head, not understanding the English words. My father tried some basic gestures he had learned from his encounters with passing merchants, pointing to himself and saying his name, then pointing to me. The little girl seemed to understand, and after a moment's hesitation, she touched her chest and said a word that sounded like flowing water. The three of us sat in the small clearing as the sun rose higher. An unlikely group bonded by the simple exchange of gifts between children, but my father's experienced eyes saw something else, something that made his chest tighten with anxiety. Behind the trees at the edge of his vision, he caught a glimpse of someone watching, someone who had witnessed everything that had happened in this clearing and had faded into the depths of the forest with the silence of those who had practiced for years. As he helped us both to our feet and began walking back to the cabin, my father wondered what kind of attention his daughter's kindness might have attracted, and whether that attention would be a blessing or a burden to his family. My mother, Sarah Whitmore, dropped the wooden spoon she was stirring when she saw her husband approaching the cabin with two children instead of one. Her first instinct was maternal panic, but as they got closer, she could see that I was unharmed and actually seemed happier than usual. The native girl walked slightly behind my father, still clutching her rag doll to her chest. Her steps were hesitant, as if she expected to be chased away at any moment. My mother had heard stories from other settler women about encounters with local tribes, most of them filled with fear and misunderstanding. But what she saw before her was simply a lost child. "She's hungry, Mom," I announced as we reached the porch. "And she's scared. Can she stay for breakfast?" My mother looked at my earnest face, then at the native girl, who stood with her eyes downcast. The child's clothes were torn in several places, and there were stains on her face that showed she had been alone for quite a while. Without hesitation, my mother opened the cabin door wide. "Of course," she said softly. "Come in, both of you." The native girl hesitated in the doorway, looking back at the woods as if considering whether to run away. But I took her hand and led her inside, chattering about the little house, as if giving a tour to a distinguished guest. My mother quickly set up an extra place at our simple wooden table, filling a bowl with the porridge she had prepared. The native girl ate slowly at first, then with increasing appetite, as if she had not tasted food for days. I sat beside her, occasionally encouraging her or pointing out interesting things around the room. "Where do you think she came from?" Mom asked Dad in a low voice as they watched us eat. "The tribal village is at least 2 days' walk away," Dad replied thoughtfully. "She's either walked a long way or been lost for a few days." As if sensing their conversation, the native girl looked up from her bowl. She spoke a few words in her own language, then pointed toward the distant mountains. Her expression was one of longing and fear, as if home was the thing she wanted most and the thing she feared most about never seeing again. I listened intently, and suddenly, I stood up from the table. I walked to the window and pointed in the same direction the little girl had pointed. "Do you want to go home?" I said simply. The little girl nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. She hugged the rag doll tighter, as if it was the only thing keeping her safe in this moment. My mother felt her heart sink at the sight. She had always imagined that if I were lost and scared, she would want someone to show the same kindness they were showing this child. "We should take her home," my mother said to my father. "Her family must be worried." But as soon as the words were out, we all heard them. The sound of hooves was approaching, not with the frantic pace of a search party, but with the steady rhythm of people who knew exactly where they were going, The native girl's head snapped up and her whole body tensed with recognition. She whispered something that sounded like a name, and for the first time since we found her, hope flashed across her face. My father went to the window and looked out into the trees. What he saw there made him stand up straight with surprise. 3 riders were approaching on painted horses, their movements graceful and confident. They were dressed in the traditional dress of the local tribe, and even from a distance, my father could see that these were no ordinary tribesmen. These were elders, men of rank and power, and they were walking straight toward our cabin with the purposeful looks of men with business to attend to. The little native girl jumped up from the table and ran to the window, pressing her little face against the glass. When she saw the horsemen approaching, she let out a cry of joy and spoke quickly in her own language. Pointing excitedly at the leading horseman, my father stepped onto the porch with his hands open and empty, a gesture of peace he had learned from previous encounters. My mother stood in the doorway with me close by, while the native girl bounced on her toes with barely contained excitement. The 3 riders approached with dignity, befitting their obvious positions. The leader was an elderly man with long black hair streaked with silver and wrinkles around his eyes that spoke of the wisdom of years of leadership. He wore ceremonial robes decorated with intricate beads, and a carved bone necklace rested on his chest. When they reached the cabin, the elder dismounted with a grace that belied his years. The native girl ran toward him, still clutching my doll, and spoke in a rush. Her words tangled with excitement as she recounted what had happened. The elder listened carefully, his dark eyes moving from the child to the Whitmore standing on the porch. His face gave nothing away, but my father could sense the intelligence behind those eyes, assessing everything he saw. When the little girl finished her story, she held up the rag doll, explaining something with animated gestures. The elder's eyes rested on me, and for a long moment, he studied the little girl who had shown such unexpected kindness to one of his people. He spoke to the native girl in their common language, asking what sounded like questions. She answered eagerly, occasionally pointing to me or the doll in her arms. During their conversation, my father heard a word that sounded like the little girl's name, repeated several times with obvious affection. Finally, the elder approached the porch. When he spoke, his English was heavy but clear, reflecting years of interaction with traders and settlers. "I am Takakota," he said solemnly. "This child is Ayana, my sister's niece. She was lost from our village 3 days ago in a storm." My mother stepped forward a little. "We are glad she is safe. She seemed lost and frightened when our daughter found her." Takakota's eyes moved to me, who had been standing silently beside my mother. The child told me of great kindness, of a gift given with a pure heart. I looked up at the majestic figure before me. I felt no fear despite his intimidating presence. "She was crying," I said simply. "Rosie makes people feel better when they are sad." The elder's calloused face softened almost imperceptibly. He knelt down to my level, bringing his eyes closer to mine. "You have given away your treasure to ease the pain of others. This is the act of a wise heart, even at such a young age." He stood and spoke quietly to his companions, who were still mounted, but watching the exchange with obvious interest. One of them nodded and urged his horse back toward the trees, disappearing into the forest with the same silence as they had come. "Your daughter has honored our people," Takakota said to my father and mother. "Such kindness creates bonds that last beyond the lives of those who created them." But even as he said these words of thanks, something in his demeanor suggested that this encounter was far from over. Takakota reached into a leather pouch at his waist and pulled out something that made my mother gasp. It was a small bracelet woven from precious metals and gemstones, delicate enough for a child's wrist, but clearly crafted with the skill of a master craftsman. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, holding it out to me. "She wore it when she was as young as you are now. It carries the protection of generations of wise women." I looked up at my parents, unsure whether I should accept such an obviously precious gift. My mother nodded encouragingly, knowing that refusing might offend. As I held out my small wrist, Takakota fastened the bracelet with gentle hands. The metal was warm against my skin, and the small stones caught the morning light in ways that made them almost come alive. "But there is more," Takakota continued, his voice becoming solemn as if performing a ritual. "A debt of honor has been created by your daughter's actions. Our people do not forget such kindness. and we will not let it go unrewarded. My father shifted uncomfortably. There is no need, he said. Clarabel does not expect anything in return. That is why the debt must be repaid, Takakota replied. Pure kindness is the rarest gift one can give to another. To ignore it dishonors both the giver and the receiver. He spoke to the other rider, who nodded and began to walk the horse slowly in circles around the cabin. My father watched this with growing concern, wondering if they were being evaluated for some purpose he did not understand. Ayana had been listening to the adults' conversation while still clutching her new doll. Suddenly, she tugged on Takakota's ceremonial robe and spoke urgently in their language. Her words seemed to surprise him, and he looked down at her with a raised eyebrow. "What did she say?" my mother asked, noticing the change in his expression. Takakota was silent for a moment, as if considering how to translate not only words, but concepts that might not exist in the settler world. She said, he translated, "The white child has the eyes of someone who sees through the surface of things. She believes your daughter has been touched by spirit." I tilted my head curiously. "What does that mean?" "Among our people, such insight is considered a great gift," Takakota explained. "Children who possess it often grow up to be healers or wise counselors. Ayana believes she recognized this quality in you as soon as you appeared in the forest." The conversation was interrupted by the return of the rider who had left earlier. He approached Takakota and spoke softly, gesturing toward the forest behind him. Whatever he reported seemed to confirm something the elder had been expecting. "The council has spoken," Takakota announced. "Tomorrow, when the sun is at its highest point, we will return. What we bring will change your family's destiny, but it will also change your place on this land." My father felt a chill of unease. What kind of change? Takakota's expression remained unreadable. "Your daughter's kindness has opened a door that has been closed for many seasons. Whether or not you choose to step through that door will determine the path your family will take from now on." He helped Ayana onto her horse, and she waved to me with obvious reluctance as she parted ways with her new friend. As the three riders prepared to depart, Takakota gave one last piece of information that left the Whitmore family watching them in stunned silence. "The land you and your grandparents are farming," he said simply, "is in the heart of territories that 3 tribes have claimed for generations. So far, no agreement has been reached." As the riders disappeared into the tree, my father and mother exchanged worried glances. My simple act of kindness seemed to have set off events beyond anything they could have imagined, and they had less than a day to prepare for consequences they could not have foreseen. Sleep did not come to the Whitmores that night. My father sat at the kitchen table long after dark, turning Takakota's words over and over in his head like stones he was trying to smooth. The thought that their small farm was in the heart of disputed tribal lands both frightened and confused him. My mother worked silently by the fire, mending her clothes with hands that shook slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. She had heard enough stories from other settlers about the land dispute to understand that their family might be facing something much bigger than themselves. Yet I slept peacefully in my small bed, the tribal bracelet glinting softly on my wrist in the moonlight streaming through the window. In my dreams, I played with Ayana in the small forest again, sharing games that needed no common language to understand. As dawn approached, my father found himself constantly scanning the horizon, looking for signs of the promised return. He went about his daily tasks with a distracted look, his mind wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. "What do you think they mean by changing our place on this land?" my mother asked as they prepared a simple breakfast. "I've been thinking about it all night," my father replied. "Maybe they want to work out some kind of farming agreement. Or maybe they're going to ask us to leave. Shall we go?" My mother's voice was soft, but the question carried the weight of our entire future. Before my father could answer, I appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and wearing the bracelet from the day before. "Are Takakota and Ayana coming back today?" I asked with the eagerness of a child anticipating the return of new friends. "Yeah, dear," said my mother. "They will come when the sun is highest in the sky." I nodded solemnly, as if this were important information that needed to be carefully considered. I spent the morning playing near the cabin, but all my games seemed to involve practicing sharing and gift-giving, as if I were preparing for another exchange. As the sun reached its peak, our family gathered on the porch to wait. The wait was different from the surprise of the day before. Now they knew something important was coming, but the uncertainty of what it was filled the air with tension. When the last of the riders appeared, there were more of them. 5 riders emerged from the trees, moving at the same steady pace as before. Takakota rode in the lead with Ayana sitting in front of him, but the other riders were men my father did not recognize. One of them led a riderless horse, but instead of an empty saddle, the animal carried something wrapped in elaborate blankets. Whatever it was secured with great care and with obvious reverence. As the group approached the cabin, my father could see that all the riders were dressed in ceremonial attire, indicating that this visit held much more significance than a simple thank you. The formal nature of their appearance made his chest tighten with anxiety. When they stopped in front of the porch, Takakota dismounted with the same dignity as before, but this time his expression carried a weight that had not been there during yesterday's meeting. The spirits have spoken across the council fires, he announced. What we bring today will bind our peoples together in ways that have not been possible for generations. But as he gestured toward the bundle slung over his horse, something in his demeanor suggested that this gift would come with responsibilities the Whitmore family had never imagined. 2 of the tribal elders carefully lifted the bundle from the backs of their horses and carried it with ritual reverence toward the cabin. When they opened the elaborate covers, what emerged took my mother's breath away. It was a chest carved from a single block of black wood and decorated with intricate designs that seemed to tell stories in their flowing patterns. The craftsmanship was unlike anything the Whitmores had ever seen. It was clear that master craftsmen had spent countless hours perfecting every detail. But it was what lay inside the chest that nearly made my father's knees buckle. Gold coins caught the sunlight like scattered stars, more wealth than he had seen in his entire life. Interspersed among the coins were precious stones, engraved jewelry, and what appeared to be official documents written in several languages. This represents the combined tribute from 3 tribal councils, Takakota explained, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. For generations, these tribes have been unable to agree on the territorial boundaries of this area. Wars have been fought, blood has been shed, and families have been torn apart. I stepped closer to inspect the beautiful chest, my young eyes widening in awe at the intricate carvings. I reached out to touch one of the carvings with my finger, and several of the tribal elders exchanged meaningful glances. Your daughter's pure act of kindness was seen as a sign. Takakota continued. The child who gave away her only treasure to comfort a stranger showed the path to peace that we had been unable to find through generations of negotiations. My father felt stunned by the implications of what he was hearing. I don't understand. What does Clarabel's kindness have to do with a territorial dispute? One of the other elders stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English. The place where your daughter found Ayana is considered sacred ground by all 3 tribes. The fact that a child showed such pure compassion there, without knowing what it meant, was interpreted as guidance from the spirits themselves. My mother's voice was barely a whisper. What are you asking of us? We are not asking, Takakota corrected gently. We are offering. This chest contains enough wealth to secure your family's future for generations. But more than that, it represents an agreement between the 3 tribal councils to recognize your family as the neutral guardians of this disputed territory. The concept was overwhelming. My father struggled to process what it meant to be caught between 3 different tribal groups responsible for maintaining peace in an area that had known conflict for decades. The responsibility will not fall solely on you. Takakota seemed to read his mind. Council members from each tribe will meet here regularly, resolve disputes. Your role will be to provide a neutral venue and ensure that the spirit of your daughter's kindness continues to guide every decision made on this land. I listened with the serious attention that children sometimes give to adult conversations they feel are important. Can Ayana come visit? I asked often. Takakota smiled for the first time since arriving. Children of all 3 tribes are welcome here. We believe that if the next generation can learn the lessons your daughter has demonstrated, the conflicts that have divided us can finally heal. My father looked at my mother, seeing his own mixture of hope and fear reflected in her eyes. The treasure in the chest would solve every financial worry they had ever faced. But the responsibility they were being offered carried risks he could not fully understand. If we accept this, he said slowly, what if the peace does not hold? What if the old conflicts return? Takakota's expression turned serious again. Then your family will be caught in the center of those conflicts. The position we offer brings great honor, but also great danger. As if to emphasize his words, the sound of approaching horses reached our ears again. But this time, the riders did not approach with the steady solemnity of tribal elders. These horses were moving fast, and there were many of them. The approaching riders belonged to the second tribal council. Arriving just as Takakota had expected, their leader dismounted and approached with dignity, speaking quickly to Takakota in their common language. Whatever he said seemed to confirm something important because Takakota nodded with satisfaction. The other councils have seen your daughter's bracelet. Takakota explained to the Whitmores, word has spread throughout all three tribes that the child has shown such kindness to one of our own. Now they have come to add their blessing to this agreement. Within minutes, representatives from the third tribal council also appeared, completing what I realized was a very important gathering. I watched with fascination as the three groups of elders began speaking to each other in different languages, occasionally gesturing toward my family and the precious chest. My mother stepped closer to my father and whispered, "This is bigger than we ever imagined. Are we ready for this kind of responsibility?" Before my father could answer, I walked straight to the center of the group of tribal leaders. My small voice rang out clearly in the afternoon air. I just wanted to help him because he was sad. I didn't know it would cause all this. The conversation stopped as all the adults turned to look at the 5-year-old girl who had inadvertently started these momentous events. My simple honesty seemed to cut through all the formalities and complicated negotiations. Takakota knelt down beside me again. My child, do you understand that your kindness has created the possibility of peace between peoples who have been fighting for many years? I considered this seriously. Does that mean more children like Ayana won't have to be scared and lost? That is exactly what it means, replied the leader from the second tribal council. If your family accepts our offer, this land will become a place where children from all tribes can play together safely. The sight of the children playing together without fear seemed to clear something in my father's mind. He looked at my mother and saw the same determination in her eyes. They had come to this frontier to build a better life for their daughter, and this opportunity offered more than they had ever dared to hope for. We accept, my father said simply. The solemn ceremony that followed would be remembered by all three tribes for generations. Documents were signed, blessings were said, and the tribute chest was formally presented to the Whitmore family. But for me, the most important moment came when Ayana climbed off Takakota's horse and ran to hug her friend. As the two of us played together while the adults completed their historic negotiations, I never imagined that this day would be remembered in the oral history of the tribe as the beginning of a great peace. I was simply happy to have my friend back and to know that Ayana would never have to be lost and afraid again. Years later, as I grew into a wise woman, helping to settle disputes between neighboring tribes, I still kept the carved wooden bird that Ayana gave me when we first met. It was a reminder that the most powerful changes in the world often begin with a simple decision to share what you have with someone who needs it more. What was once a humble log cabin on the frontier has become a gathering place where three proud tribes learn to resolve their differences through words rather than conflict. All because a 5-year-old girl believed that no child should cry alone in the woods.